want to talk about East Africa, and I want to get to debt. Let's get straight to the heart of the matter. I mean, East Africa has been in the news for all the wrong reasons in recent months. And against the backdrop of violence and regional tensions, there is this growing debt crisis, which of course is exacerbated by COVID-19. Last week, the African Development Bank published its 2021 African Economic Outlook. It had mixed messages regarding East Africa. On the one hand, it suggested that East Africa might be the most resilient region based on its less reliance on commodities and greater diversification. But on the other hand, it suggests that many of the region states are already on the way to debt distress. Can you explain this?
Thank you for having me. It's much appreciated. Let me, first of all, just talk about East Africa in the wider context, including, I think, Ethiopia as well. So yes, the African Development Bank, in the comparison between East and West and North and Southern Africa, said that East Africa is more resilient than the other regions. There's less dependency on commodities per se, and I think that helps the East African region. But as you said, the debt problem is now front and center. It was accelerated by the pandemic, which was until now more an economic emergency than a medical one. But currently, we have Ethiopia and Kenya hitting record highs, and Tanzania, certainly, if they produce the data, would be at in the same boat. So it is very, very worrying at the moment. I think in Kenya's case, the IMF, which gave us $2.3 billion or 2.4 over 3 years, but in the fine print said Kenya was at high risk of debt distress. I think Ethiopia, which was a darling of the African Renaissance, is similarly in a very precarious position. Tanzania less so, Uganda less so as well. I think Kenya is really the concern at the moment. We've had a borrowing binge, very poor return on our investments, and very poor return projected for the next few years. So essentially, I think we've kicked the can down the road a little bit. We'll get some support from the multilaterals. Kenya is important geoeconomically, particularly in the context of what's happening to the north as well. So I think, the freight train's coming at us. The question is, we can see the light, but it's not here yet. And I expect it to be hitting us hard in the next 6 months to the next 18 months.
You mentioned the IMF. I mean, as you know, the IMF normally demand fiscal reform and improved governance before agreeing to packages and debt relief. Do you think that's possible with the current?
So, the IMF, of course, is remembered for the 1990s and its structural adjustment programs, and it's a much softer institution now under Christina Georgieva. And is clearly playing a different role to what you would call in the the role it played in the 1990s. However, I mean, the IMF comes with strings attached, and I have to say that, I don't think Kenya's in charge of its own financial destiny anymore. I don't think the IMF has moved into the treasury, but it's pretty close to moving in. And I forecast that in next sort of 6 to 18 months, they'll have their feet under the table. The question then will be, how aggressive they will be in terms of the conditionalities. If you look across the continent so far, they've been treading quite softly. They're obviously carrying a big stick, but treading softly. And I think for now, in the context of the geopolitical scenario and the desire to probably keep Kenya on side, I would have thought they will continue to tread carefully, particularly because there's an election due next year. And like we've seen in other countries which are in a more precarious position, Zambia, for example, governments don't like to be constrained in the run-up to the election, because if you're not pushing out goodies, your chances of controlling the outcome is reduced.
On debt relief, I mean, it's also being sought from commercial lenders. There are reports in Ethiopia that Ethiopia was looking to talk to its Eurobond holders after the value of the Eurobonds fell in February of this year. However, we've also seen Eurobond holders in Zambia hold their ground, even though both the government and just last week the opposition has foreshadowed a haircut for the bondholders. Do you think the private creditors will be open to discussions?
So this was a point that was made at length in the presentation around the African Development Bank economic release. Both Stiglitz and the president of the African Development Bank, Adesina, said that private bondholders and creditors are simply going to have to, give relief and have to come to the party. And they seem to have so far kept a semi-detached situation going. Look, first of all, the comments I heard out of the South African Reserve Bank governor were very interesting. He said, look, private bondholders are not just Eurobond holders out of Europe and North America. And remember, that's hard-earned money. That's people's pensions that they've been investing. It's not just, Santa Claus money that can be forgiven at the drop of a hat. But the point he made was, for example, in South Africa, a huge amount of these bonds are held by local institutions. So the point is, it's not just internationals who are being asked to make a concession. It would also impact local institutions, and therefore I think it's quite complicated. And of course, the elephant in the room is China, because the Chinese currently, although they came within the DSSI, they typically tend to look to negotiate separately. So you've got all these different stakeholders that you've got to manage. And for now, what we've achieved is just an interest moratorium for a few months. The hard negotiation is going to come in the future. It's going to come down the track. And I think it's not going to be so straightforward, because a lot of these countries also fought very hard to get to the Eurobond market. And I can guarantee you, if they start demanding debt forgiveness, they're not going to get back to that Eurobond market for many, many years. And this is something Kenya, for example, has been quite cognizant of. And that's why they keep sort of saying, look, we're not going to be asking for debt forgiveness, because they realize once they do that, they're out of the game, they're off the pitch, they're on the subs bench, and that could last a very, very long time. So I think, these tough calls have yet to be made. I think private Eurobond holders are going to fight very, very hard. But the good thing about the Eurobond market is, of course, it's transparent, it prices in real time, and we will basically get signals out of there as to what's actually looking like happening. And for now, I think the Eurobond market is staying reasonably liquid. We've got some issuance coming. Kenya's trying to come under cover of that IMF program. It's trying to call about $1 billion in the next few weeks. They've already put out RFPs. So it's multi-dimensional, Simon, and for now it's difficult to see which way this thing breaks.
But you mentioned Kenya and its really reasonable approach to the Eurobond market. Does it make a difference for a country like Kenya, that of course has relatively strong governance levels, versus an emerging country? And I'm thinking about the Sudan, South Sudan and Sudan, who are in the process of negotiating IMF reform packages. Is it a different battle for them?
Yes, I think in many respects it is. And, what I would describe it is like a continuum. You've got sophisticated communicators, sophisticated policymakers, and the most sophisticated I find are probably the Egyptians and the South Africans. They know how to message the markets. They know how to run coherent policy making. The message is consistent. Then you probably have the likes of Kenya, a lot of ex-IMF folks. They know what needs to be said. They understand, where the rail tracks are, and they try and stay on that. And then you have, wild cards like South Sudan. I mean, South Sudan really, given the track record of the last few years, is simply not tenable for the Eurobond markets in any shape or form. And we know the backstory, we know what's happened there. It's entirely unfortunate, but it's been a case of pillage and robbery, essentially. So, you can't spin that story any which way. I would say the North, Khartoum, probably has a much better story to tell. And I would somehow imagine that Khartoum could probably sell a Eurobond right now. A lot of potential in that economy, much more joined up thinking about how to approach the markets, how to, you've seen a sea change post Bashir. In the last months, you've got the US support coming through. You've got the Middle East who probably back it as well. So if I was thinking about it, I could forecast, Khartoum launching a Eurobond or a Sukuk bond, for example, and telling a reasonable story around it. Unfortunately, I don't think there'd be a coherent story coming out of Juba, for example.
Let's talk about growth. I mean, economic growth has contracted or slowed down considerably over the past year for obvious reasons. I mean, looking ahead, do you think the countries will follow similar trajectories in reviving their economies? Are their economies diversified enough? Is there a difference between the petro-states and the non-resource dependent economies? A lot of questions wrapped up in there, but tackle it how you will.
Yeah, very much so. So just to give a big picture, look, Africa last year contracted at 2.1% in 2020, first recession in half a century, according to the African Development Bank. They're projecting 3.4% in 2021. East Africa is projected to rebound harder and range around the 5% mark. Let me frame this by first saying that, there is different types of growth. There was this famous refrain that sort of resonated around the continent, is that you can't eat GDP. A lot of the growth we've experienced in the last 5 to 10 years has had very poor trickle down. Let's take Kenya's SGR railway, the largest investment by Kenya since independence. Essentially, there has been very little trickle down out of that. It's returning a negative rate of return at the moment. People have not experienced any economic uplift that they can directly point at the SGR and say, look, if anything, it's actually reduced economic growth because the government has had to squeeze Kenyans in order to pay the interest and pay the negative return that's been achieved. So I think, we look at these GDP figures sometimes without thinking, what's actually going on behind them. So I would be slightly skeptical about headline numbers we've been seeing and say that, really, if you strip out government spending, what has been actually going on in these economies has not been as positive or dramatic as some of our governments have managed to spin it. With respect to GDP this year, I agree that East Africa, because of its low dependence on producing oil out of the ground like Nigeria, has had to build a more diversified economy. And also, in many places, Kenya is a good example, Uganda probably even better, and Tanzania, very strong agricultural sectors. And people underestimate what this means. It means that the average East African, wherever he might be, actually has half an acre or an acre somewhere that they can say that they can grow food on. So what happened with the pandemic was quite interesting. A lot of people left the cities and went back to their villages because they could survive there. So in a way, it reduced the risk of unrest in our urban centers, where we got a lot of people you can imagine who found themselves out of a job and so forth. But they were able to survive in their home villages, something that you don't have in South Africa, for example, because of the apartheid system, where these people lost their land. So that's another additional positive. And overall, I think, look, I'm expecting a rebound, but I think the big elephant in the room is debt. You can already see governments continue to squeeze their citizens with higher and higher tax rates. Adesina of the African Development Bank said Africans have the highest implicit tax rate anywhere in the world. And I second that. I think it's just, and I think we're reaching a point where you just can't continue in that direction. You know, governments just say, oh, we'll dump some more tax on everybody. We're reaching a tolerance level where they can't do that anymore, in my view. But you know, I do expect East Africa to outperform West Africa and Southern Africa. North Africa, Egypt and Morocco probably outperform East Africa.
What about sector specific? And if we go back to what's happened over the last year with COVID-19, travel and tourism, I mean, how important will the rollout of the vaccine be for the revival of this industry, and how much impact has that had?
So that's a very interesting question. And, you know, for Kenya, for example, tourism and travel is one of the 3 or 4 pillars of the economy. It's worth a headline figure of about $1.2 billion a year. Tanzania, probably a little bit more, about 1.4, 1.5. Uganda, less. Rwanda, of course, is a niche player, but playing in a very good niche where it's getting high value addition from its gorillas and so forth. Ethiopia, frankly, probably write off whichever way you look at it this year. Now, the challenge is, for example, around the vaccine deployment, the speed of deployment in Africa. And, you know, I think anyone, even the most optimistic, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed person, is going to have to admit that it's highly unlikely vaccinations will be deployed at sufficient scale this year or into the middle of next year. So we've got a very serious challenge, and we're seeing that actually unfold in terms of our COVID numbers. We're in wave 3 now. We're getting hit quite hard. Ethiopia's at a record high. Kenya is 22% test positivity rate today. So these are high and concerning numbers. And I think there's talk of the British now putting us on the red list. So, you know, I'm very concerned about this space. I just don't see a fast recovery. I think at my most optimistic projection, it's Q4 this year before we start seeing a nascent recovery. On the positive side, interestingly, there have been folks who've taken off and left the UK, parked themselves on the beach in Diani here in Kenya. And thankfully, we have a tremendous internet connection, and are basically, you know, happy to work from, you know, basically become digital nomads. But there isn't sufficient scale in that. The money's really made, you know, when thousands of tourists come through the gates of Jomo Kenyatta or Tanzania's airport. So I think tourism is going to continue to remain under pressure. I don't see the recovery happening anytime soon. Interestingly, I was looking at Seychelles, which has practically vaccinated at the fastest rate globally. It's a small population, 100,000, least number of population of any country in Africa. So I think that might be an interesting proxy to watch. But, you know, countries like Kenya and Tanzania with big populations, it's a different ballgame altogether.
You're making me jealous. I wish I'd up to move to Diani for lockdown. Anyway, on that note, I want to now sort of get to conflict and governance and the link between that and the economy. I mean, we've discussed at length with previous guests, but I'm interested in your economic take on this. How do countries, for example, to go back to South Sudan, who really were built on a war economy, the governments formed of former militias that perennially fought each other. How do you transition out of this kind of state to developing an economy on a non-military footing? And maybe it's a discussion we'll be having about Ethiopia in a few years' time.
So that's a very interesting question. I remember being in Juba around the independence and the enormous optimism that was there at that time. I visited again a couple of times, and and now one looks at the situation, and really, I think they've failed to deliver. I think, notwithstanding enormous international support, what we clearly see is that the South Sudanese militia, the SPLM, simply did not have the skill set or wherewithal to translate into a normally functioning economy. It is an incredibly rich country. I mean, you've got the Nile running through there, you've got enough water, you could have an agricultural powerhouse. But essentially, we've had, a tremendous amount of mismanagement. They've probably forward sold all their oil for the next 5 years. It is a dreadful situation. And I think, unfortunately, we continue to pander to these folks and who have utterly failed. It's like going to school and getting an E and going to the person with the E and saying, you keep going, buddy, and you're expecting them to jump to an A. They failed. They can't do it. They don't understand what they've got to do. They don't comprehend it. They come out of a background which is totally different. And I think, therefore, I'm sorry to be negative, but I think that transition is going to take much longer. And I feel very sorry for the South Sudanese, whom, the average citizen I found is very, had so much bullishness about what was going to happen. And it unfortunately has not happened. I mean, it's become a merry-go-round of peace talks and reconciliation. It's a complete farce. And as far as I can see, I haven't met an individual, and I meet them a lot because half of them are parked here in Nairobi, who can tell me, look, I know the way forward, we can build a real economy, we can create jobs for our people. It's a sort of scarcity mentality. I think also you touched very briefly on Ethiopia, and I think, if I may, just add a couple of comments on that, because, there, of course, we've got this, we had this prime minister who spoke the language of Nelson Mandela. I remember he wore Mandela's shirt at one point, and he really talked the talk, got the Nobel Prize. I for one, was completely consumed by his linguistics and thought really this was a man who was going to pull it all together and take it to the next level. They were kind of, the model was interesting. They were kind of on the runway. If he could hold it together, one could have argued that there was, that there could have been a liftoff. GDP rates of ranging between 8 and 10%, how believable they are is a different matter. But essentially what we've seen is, in my opinion, is a complete crashing and burning here. This whole idea of bringing Tigray province to heel has failed. It seems there will be a mini insurrection there now ongoing for the foreseeable future, or it will be garrisoned by the Eritreans. You can see that the signal to other regions is now, you can't trust the center. You need to protect your own interests. So you've got, I think, an unfolding fragmentation, a Yugoslavia situation that's going to unfold there. In terms of the economy, everyone gets excited, 110 million people, we've all got to march up to Ethiopia. Everyone is marching out now, Simon. I mean, it's highly unlikely, in my view, that Ethiopia will recover in the short term. I think you're now looking at a medium-term situation. And essentially, I think you've got another situation there where the centrifugal forces now are going to be impossible. It's a genie, he's let it out of the bottle. I don't know how he puts it back in again. And therefore, I'm quite bearish on the economy there, I have to admit.
It's interesting, both the point you made then and the one that you made before about Juba. I mean, I'm thinking about this in the context of Western interventionism and how important those economies became, you know, as a sort of poster child of the aid industry, the NGO industry. I mean, economically speaking, does the involvement of aid agencies and NGOs skew economic incentives? Is an aid-driven approach encouraging perverse behaviour? I mean, reliance at best, corruption at worst?
You know, I think something like South Sudan obviously needed external assistance. It could never have stood up on its own. I think, you know, to have expected people who'd fought in the bush to put together a coherent economy was a very big call. And I don't mean that in any negative manner. So I think, you know, international support was very, very important. But, you know, in my experience of going to Juba and looking at what was actually going on, there were very perverse incentives. There was a lot of chicanery going on. There was, you know, there was a complete lack of coherence and a lack of, when you met policymakers, and I met finance ministers and I met a whole bunch of people, there was no coherent policy there to build a thriving economy. And I think, you know, a lot of money was spent on reconciliation and peace talks. That money should have been spent on educating people on economics, about how to build an economy, where to place your bets, not to rely on just 95% of your income coming in off oil and trying to sort of forward sell that oil. That was a finite resource. There was no attempt really to build, you know, an agricultural economy which could have been built. There was no attempt to do anything. And I remember just from the roads, there were very few roads which were built. You know, it's not about rocket science. It's about very simple things. But also, it really starts with security and about people feeling safe. And I don't think they've ever delivered that.
Fascinating. Now let's get to elections. It's been a very busy year for elections in the region. We've got disputed election results in Uganda and Tanzania, which is of course complicated by the death of President Magufuli. Somalia has put its elections on hold, and we're waiting for the confirmation of the parliamentary elections in Ethiopia, which we've just discussed. With the disruption brought on by the pandemic and the increasing authoritarianism in some of these region states, how hopeful are you that we can protect democracy? It's a loaded question.
Yeah, that's very
Tell me.
I mean, you know, I've been watching with increasing dismay various election cycles across the continent, and I struggle to find one election that I would call free and fair. And you know, I also struggle to find. I think these elections you've talked about, Uganda, Tanzania. The results were clearly inflated in favor of the ruling regime, and I think, you know, if I look at that situation, and I'm watching Congo right now, where you've got somebody who's been there for 37 years, you've got a bunch of elections happening on the continent, and I can't help feeling that we're reaching a tipping point moment when, you know, this sort of very authoritarian faux democracy, you know, you can't call it democracy as far as I can see, is going to hit a tipping point moment when people will just get so fed up that it won't be able to hold. And you know, the question then becomes, can you manage that process when that starts to happen? Just to go through the elections you spoke about, Uganda, to be fair, if you analyze that very closely, the opposition might well have won that election, frankly. You look at someone like Tanzania, the numbers that were produced by the ruling party were, I think, 30% higher than the historical average. So, you can say again, this was just simply not possible. Somalia, you've got this very interesting situation with Famajo, but you've got a much more fluid situation, a lot of players in there. And Ethiopia, essentially, you've had somebody practically go to war with a region which held an election, which was, so you've got somebody who's unelected, who's gone against one of his provinces, which held, to me, what looked like a pretty free and fair election. So we got a very sort of curious situation developing. As you said, the pandemic accelerated authoritarianism in many respects. We've got governments which, and this is a global phenomenon, really. I mean, it's not just African. We can watch it. The UK, for example, I was just looking through the recent legislation causing a disturbance or annoyance. I mean, what does that mean? It basically means you can't go and protest. If that's such a subjective phrase, in my view. So I think we've got this global trend. And within that, we've got this African trend, which is going on at the moment. But when I look at it, I think there's a change coming. We've got such a youthful population. You're seeing the change in the urban areas because that's where a lot of youth are. That's where the opposition is winning very, very clearly. The rural areas tend to be more conservative. But I think, the change is going to happen. And I think it's going to be more and more difficult for these governments to control the outcome going forward. And I think, if we had free and fair elections, we would not have the governments we currently have.
Very lucid take. So I come to my final question, and it's an open-ended one. What are your hopes for the region?
When I get sort of concerned, I just look at the human capital, the people I interact with, the average person out there in Nairobi trying to make a living. And what I realize, and what gives me optimism, is that the most valuable capital in Africa is not what you can dig out of the ground, although that's very valuable, and Africans historically have not gotten a true equity share of what's been dug out of the ground. But the most valuable capital is the human capital. And if you look at the demographics, it can be a demographic disaster if we don't provide jobs for these people, right? Everyone calls it, every economist you'll meet, look at Africa, a demographic dividend. It's only a demographic dividend if you've got electricity, you educate everybody, and you do what Asia did. Otherwise, you're going to have a completely different outcome. So what gives me optimism is the African himself. My brothers and sisters, I think they are resilient. They've had to survive under very tough conditions, which you would not meet in the West. There is no safety net here, so you've got to be very, very resilient. And I think my optimistic side is how do we unlock the potential of the people? And again, Adesina spoke about this, saying, so many people of ours are dying in the bottom of the sea in the Mediterranean, and we've got to stop them leaving the continent, and we've got to bring them back and give them an opportunity. If you look at remittances, Simon, this has surged, over a 10-year period. Remittances have overtaken ODA, have overtaken every single investment into the continent. And that is what makes me optimistic, because it tells me that Africans can monetize their human capital abroad. The question is, how do we bring it back so they can monetize it at home? And to do that, we've got to create enabling environments. We've got to have enabling politics, and we've got to allow this potential to unfold in the country. And that's what excites me about the continent.
Well, Aly-Khan Satchu, it's always a tremendous pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, and we wish you all well.